There is a village in the eastern foothills that no longer appears on any modern map. Its name was struck from the provincial record sometime in the mid-19th century. The church that stood at its centre was demolished, the stones carted away, and used to pave a road that leads to a city whose own history has been carefully managed, carefully trimmed, carefully shaped into something that fits inside the story we are all supposed to believe. The village had a name once. The people who lived there had names, and one of them, a woman who kept an inn at the edge of a forest, had a secret that the authorities of her time were willing to erase an entire settlement to contain. What she was hiding was not a fugitive in the ordinary sense. It was not a criminal, not a deserter from some forgotten army, not a political dissident whose pamphlets had upset the wrong minister. What she was hiding was something that the official world of the 19th century had already decided could not exist. Something that walked through the forest at night and left footprints in the mud that measured nearly 3 feet from heel to toe. Something that had to duck not just through doorways but through the inn's entire ground floor corridor, sideways, folding itself into the back storage room where the barrels and the root vegetables were kept, and where the innkeeper had cleared a space large enough for a body that measured, by her own written account, somewhere between 11 and 13 feet in standing height. Her name was Marta. That much survived. A single letter, written in a dialect that linguists have quietly argued about for over a century, was preserved inside a private collection in what is now Central Europe. The letter was addressed to her sister. It was never sent. It was found tucked inside the false bottom of a travelling trunk that had been sold at auction, passed through several hands, and eventually donated to a private archive by a collector who did not fully understand what he had acquired. The archivist who translated it did not publish his findings through any mainstream channel. He shared them in a small printed pamphlet that circulated among a very specific community of researchers who had long suspected that the historical record of the 19th century was not the complete record, that it was, in fact, a curated record. A record built on deletions. Marta's letter begins with an apology. She apologizes to her sister for not writing sooner, and she explains that she has been frightened. Not of the creature in her back room, she says, but of the men who she knows are looking for it. She calls them the counting men. In the dialect she used, the phrase carries a specific connotation, something closer to the men who measure and record and decide what is real. She had seen them in the nearest town. She had heard from a travelling merchant that they had already visited 2 other villages to the north, asking questions, paying for information, leaving behind a particular kind of silence that a village never quite recovers from. She had found the giant in the forest 3 weeks before she wrote the letter, or rather, it had found her. She had gone out before dawn to check on a goat that had been making distressed sounds through the night, and she had walked into the tree line and discovered a figure sitting against the base of an enormous oak, its knees drawn up to its chest, its head bowed. She thought at first it was a structure, a remnant of something built and abandoned. The scale was too large for her mind to immediately process as a living thing. Then it moved, it raised its head and looked at her, and she stood completely still in the grey pre-dawn light and did not run. She does not explain in her letter why she did not run. She only says that its eyes were tired, and that she had seen that specific kind of tiredness before in her husband's face in the weeks before he died, and that it made her feel not afraid, but sorrowful. She brought it food. That first morning she brought what she had in her apron pocket, which was a heel of bread and some dried apple, and she set it on the ground between them and stepped back, and it reached out a hand and took the bread and ate it in a single motion, and looked at her again, and she understood that it was very hungry and had been hungry for a long time. She went back to the inn and brought more. She brought a full wheel of cheese and a smoked ham and a bucket of water, and she made 4 trips and stacked everything at the base of the oak tree. And by the time she made her 4th trip, the sun was coming up and she could see it clearly for the first time. She describes it in her letter with the careful precision of someone who understands that she may be the only person to ever write this down truthfully. She says its hair was very dark, nearly black, and long, matted with what she guessed was months of forest living. Its clothing, such as it was, appeared to be made from material she could not identify, not wool, not linen, not any leather she had ever seen tanned. It had the texture, she writes, of something older than anything in the market. Its face was proportioned like a human face, but larger in every dimension, and its expression, even at rest, carried a quality she can only describe as ancient grief, like a face that had forgotten how to arrange itself for ordinary life, and had settled instead into something permanent and inward. She asked it to come inside. She had already made this decision before she fully understood what the decision meant. She led it around the back of the inn, through the yard, through the wide storage door she used for receiving barrels from the brewery cart, and she showed it the space she had cleared, and it folded itself down into the corner and let out a sound she describes as the first peaceful sound she had heard it make, like an exhalation that had been held for longer than one breath. For 3 days it did not speak. It ate what she brought and slept most of the time, and occasionally opened its eyes and watched her when she came in to leave food or check that it was comfortable. On the 4th day it spoke to her in a language she did not recognize, a slow, deliberate series of sounds that she tried to reproduce phonetically in her letter, and which the archivist who translated her account attempted to analyze without coming to a definitive conclusion. He noted only that several of the syllable patterns bore a structural resemblance to certain very old written languages that modern scholarship had declared extinct before the Common Era, languages that should not have had living speakers in the 19th century. Languages that should not have had living speakers at all. She could not understand it. She told it this gently in her own dialect, and then it tried again, this time in something closer to the language of the region, halting and imperfect but comprehensible, the way a person speaks a tongue they learned long ago and have not used recently. And what it said to her, in that halting, careful speech, was this. It said that it had been walking for a very long time. It said that it had been walking since the cities fell. And when she asked which cities, it looked at her with that expression of ancient grief and said the ones beneath your feet, the ones you are standing on right now. Before we go further into what the giant told her, it is worth pausing on who Marta was, because the archivist who found her letter took care to establish her character through cross-referencing several sources that have since themselves gone quiet. She had run the inn alone for 7 years by the time the giant arrived in her forest. Her husband had been a builder of some local reputation, a man who worked primarily in stone, and who had been involved in several projects connected to the new provincial infrastructure that was being laid across the region in the first half of the 19th century. He had died young, of a lung sickness that came on suddenly, and which Marta had always privately connected to a particular job he had taken in a city to the east, a job that required him to work underground, beneath the foundations of a building that was being expanded. He had come home from that job quieter than he had left, and the quietness had deepened over the months that followed until it became the permanent quietness of the grave. Marta had kept the inn going through a combination of practical intelligence and a manner that people trusted. She was not soft by her neighbours' accounts. She was fair, which is a different thing. She extended credit when it was warranted and called it in without apology when it was not. She kept a clean house and a good fire and a kitchen that travellers remembered and told other travellers about, which is the only marketing that an inn at the edge of a forest has ever needed. She was also, and this matters to understanding why she did what she did, a woman who had spent 7 years running a business alone in a region where the provincial authorities had been steadily consolidating their oversight of everything from road use to the licensing of trades, and she had developed a very specific and well-calibrated suspicion of official documentation. She had watched the new maps arrive. She had watched the new boundary stones get planted. She had watched the old families lose pieces of their land to processes they did not fully understand, administered by men with papers who arrived without warning and left without explanation. She knew what administrative erasure looked like at close range, and she was not disposed to assist it. This is the detail that has made Marta's letter significant to researchers working outside the boundaries of conventional historical study. Because what the giant described over the following days, in slow, careful fragments that Marta transcribed as best she could into her letter, aligned in its broad outlines with something that a growing number of investigators have identified in the physical and documentary record of the 19th century. The possibility that beneath the cities of what we call the modern world, beneath the streets and the foundations and the buried layers that archaeologists have carefully categorized and labeled, there lies evidence of an earlier civilization. A civilization of extraordinary scale and technical achievement. A civilization that the architects of the 19th century historical project worked very hard to either absorb into a manageable narrative or erase entirely from the record. The giant told her about buildings. It described structures of a kind that matter had no framework to understand. Buildings that heated and cooled themselves, buildings whose walls conducted something it called the living current, buildings that sang, it said, when the wind moved through them correctly. It described a city whose central tower was so tall that the clouds passed through its upper floors, and whose foundations ran so deep into the earth that the builders had found, in digging them, the remains of an even older city beneath, and had incorporated those older stones into the new construction as a form of reverence. It described roads that ran between cities without joints or seams, roads that never cracked because they were not made of separate pieces, but poured in a single continuous action, using a technique that it said required an understanding of stone that the current world had lost. Marta asked it when these cities existed. It gave her a number that she wrote down in her letter, and that the archivist noted with particular care. The number it gave was not thousands of years in the past. The number it gave placed the existence of these cities within what we would recognize as the recent historical period, within the last few centuries, within a time frame that overlaps with the period that mainstream history describes as the age of exploration, the age of revolution, the age of industrial awakening. The giant was not describing a lost prehistoric civilization in the way that the word lost civilization is commonly understood. It was describing something that had been recently destroyed, something whose ruins, it said, were still warm when it began walking. The question of how these cities were destroyed is where Marta's transcription becomes fragmented and difficult. She notes in her letter that this was the part of the giant's account that seemed to cost it the most to speak. It would fall silent for long periods. It would turn its face toward the wall. She writes that once, when she pressed it gently on this question, it made a sound that she could only describe as weeping, though the sound was lower and slower than any weeping she had heard from a human being, more like a sustained resonance in the chest that the whole room seemed to absorb. She stopped pressing it after that. She waited for it to offer what it could. What it offered was this. It said that the destruction did not come from outside. It said that there were people. It used a word she transliterated, and the archivist suggested might be translated as the administrators, or the overseers, or perhaps most accurately, the ones who kept the counts. And it said that these people had decided at some point that it described as a great turning, that the civilization as it existed was ungovernable, that it was too large, too interconnected, too fluent in its own power, that the people within it understood too much about the living current, about the properties of stone and water, and the resonant frequencies of large structures, and that this understanding made them difficult to control in the ways that the administrators required. And so the administrators had engineered a collapse, not through a single dramatic, catastrophic event, but through a slow, systematic dismantling, through the removal of certain kinds of knowledge from circulation, through the deliberate disruption of the networks that carried the living current between cities, through the introduction of new counting systems, new languages, new maps that redrew the boundaries of the known world in ways that cut people off from their own history, that made the recent past seem distant, and the distant past seem mythological, and mythology itself seem like the confused dreaming of primitive minds. Marta sat with this. She writes in her letter that she sat with it for a long time. She was not an educated woman in the formal sense. She had not read the philosophers or the historians. She ran an inn at the edge of a forest. But she was observant, and she had lived through enough of her own era's reorganizations, the new provincial boundaries, the new church authorities, the new paper money replacing the old coin, the new school books that told stories about the past that the oldest people in the village remembered differently, to recognize the shape of what the giant was describing. She writes that it felt to her like hearing a large version of something she had always known was happening, but had never had the words to name. She asked it what it wanted, why it had stayed in the forest instead of continuing to walk, why it had allowed her to bring it inside when a creature of its size and evident strength could have simply continued moving and been very difficult for anyone to catch. Before she received that answer, it gave her another night's worth of description, And what it described was not merely the existence of the great cities, but the specific way they worked. And this part of her letter is the part that researchers in this particular field of inquiry have returned to most often, because it maps so precisely onto the physical anomalies that others have been documenting independently for years. It described the building material of the city's primary structures as something that functioned differently from any stone martyr would have known. She writes that it used a word she could not directly translate, but that when she pressed it to describe the process, it told her that the material was grown rather than quarried. That it began as a substance with the consistency of thick mud, and was poured and shaped and then encouraged through the application of the living current to crystallize in place, taking on properties of hardness and resonance that no quarried stone could match. It said that structures built this way rang like bells when struck correctly, and that this ringing was not merely a pleasant side effect, but a functional property. That the vibration of correctly shaped stone, channeled through the geometry of the building's design, was itself a form of energy that the inhabitants of the cities had learned to harvest and direct. It said the great domes were not decorative. They were collecting surfaces. They gathered the resonance of the Earth's own frequency and concentrated it and made it available for use in the way that a lens concentrates light. She asked how the current was distributed between buildings, between cities. It described a network that ran underground, following the paths of natural water channels and enhanced by deliberately placed conducting elements whose composition it tried to explain and she tried to transcribe. And the archivist's note on this section of the letter is simply that the described materials bear a structural resemblance to certain mineral compounds that 19th century chemistry had not yet fully characterized. The network, the giant said, covered most of the known world. Not every place equally, but every major settlement was connected to it in some degree, and the large cities were so deeply integrated with it that they could not have functioned without it. Which meant, it said quietly, that when the administrators decided to dismantle the network, the cities did not need to be destroyed directly. They only needed to be disconnected, cut off from the current that ran through their walls and their foundations, and the street paving that Marta would have called impossibly seamless. Once the current stopped, the buildings did not immediately fall, but they became cold in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Cold in their function, and the people in them who had lived their whole lives in structures that hummed with a specific frequency they had never consciously noticed, because it had always been present, began to experience a disorientation that the administrators could then describe as illness, as madness, as the confusion of populations that had never been properly managed. The administrators, the giant told her, were very skilled at providing explanations for the things they caused. It told her it was tired. It told her that it had been walking since the cities fell, and that it did not know how long that had been because the counting of time had changed so many times since then that it had lost confidence in any of the numbers. It told her that when it had seen her in the grey light before dawn and she had not run, something in it had decided to rest. It said that it had spent a very long time in a world that ran from the sight of it, and that it had forgotten what it felt like to be in the presence of a person who looked at it and felt sorrow instead of fear, and that this feeling had been more powerful than its instinct to continue moving. It also told her something that she records near the end of the section of her letter dealing with their conversations, something that she seems to have hesitated to write down, because she prefaces it with a phrase that translates roughly as, "I know this will sound like the talking of a person whose mind has come loose from its moorings, but I am writing it down because I believe it to be true, and because I may not have another opportunity to write anything down at all." The giant told her that it was not the only one. It told her that others of its kind had survived the destruction of the cities, and that they moved through the world the way it moved, in forests and in mountain passes, and in the deep places beneath large bodies of water, where the counting men could not easily follow. It told her that they remembered, that the specific purpose of their continued existence, the reason they kept walking when everything in them wanted to stop, was that they carried the memory of the civilization in their bodies, not in any written form that could be seized or burned or retranslated into something acceptable, but in a living memory, in the accumulated experience of having been present for the building of those structures and the laying of those roads and the cultivation of that understanding of the living current, that as long as any of them still walked, the civilization was not entirely gone. that it persisted in the way that a fire persists when it is banked, invisible on the surface, live coals underneath. She asked him if he was afraid of the counting men. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said that fear was not the correct word. He said that he had watched them work for longer than she could easily imagine, and that what he felt toward them was something closer to a clear-eyed recognition of what they were and what they required. He said that they required invisibility from everything they could not count and measure and assign to a category that fit inside the story they were building. He said that as long as he remained invisible, he was safe, and that invisibility had been the primary work of the remaining ones for as long as they had been walking. He asked her, toward the end of their last full conversation before the counting men arrived, whether she had a place she trusted. Not a place she owned, but a place she trusted. Whether there was ground she knew well enough to hide something in. She asked him what he meant, and he said that he had carried something with him from the cities. A small object, not small by ordinary human standards, but small relative to his own size, which she describes as approximately the size of a hat-box, though of a shape she could not easily compare to anything she knew. He said that it was one of many such objects that had been distributed among the remaining ones before they dispersed, and that each object carried within it a record. Not a written record, but something she might think of as a stored resonance, an encoding of the knowledge of the civilization in a form that could not be read by the counting men's instruments because it did not operate on any principle that their instruments were designed to detect. She took it from him and buried it in the root cellar beneath the inn, beneath the flagstones, beneath the lower layer of soil, in the place where the earth was cold and undisturbed. She writes that it was heavier than its size suggested, and that when she held it she felt something that she describes as a warmth that was not temperature, a warmth that seemed to come from inside the thing and radiate outward through her hands and up her arms, and she stood very still in the root cellar for a moment, because she was afraid that if she moved she would somehow disrupt something she did not understand. Then she set it down and covered it and replaced the flagstone and went back upstairs and told him what she had done, and he made the sound she had by then come to recognize as the giant equivalent of a long, relieved breath. The counting men came 2 days later. Marta's letter ends abruptly, mid-sentence, in a way that suggests she heard them arriving and had only enough time to push the letter into the trunk where it was eventually found. The village records, such as they are, note only a visit from provincial authorities on a date that corresponds to Marta's timeline. The inn is not mentioned again in any subsequent document. The village itself appears in one final census record, after which it is gone. The names that were listed in that census do not appear in any neighbouring villages' records in the years that follow. Not in birth records, not in marriage records, not in death records. It is worth being specific about what this disappearance means in practical terms, because the pattern it represents is one that appears in the 19th century record with a regularity that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. When a community is relocated due to genuine hardship, due to famine or flood or economic collapse, the people scatter but the names persist. They turn up in the records of the places they move to. Their children are baptized somewhere. Their deaths are recorded somewhere. The bureaucratic trace of a human life is difficult to eliminate entirely when the life simply ends or moves. But when a community is subject to the kind of administrative erasure that the counting men specialized in, the names do not simply scatter. They stop. There is a before and there is a silence, and in the silence there is not the usual background noise of births and deaths and property transfers and disputes and marriages that a living population generates. There is just nothing, the kind of nothing that has to be actively created, the kind of nothing that takes work. What happened in the storage room of Marta's Inn, the researchers who have studied this case can only speculate. Whether the giants submitted or resisted, or whether the counting men arrived to find an empty room and a disturbed innkeeper who claimed to know nothing, the record does not say, because the record was removed. What can be said is that in the months following the provincial visit there are no further references to anything unusual in the forest of the eastern foothills. The anomalies stop. The footprints stop if there were footprints in any official record to begin with. Whatever the counting men found or did not find, the region was declared quiet. There is a forest in the eastern foothills that is older than the maps that name it. The trees there grow in patterns that foresters have noted without explanation. Certain clearings where nothing will take root, certain areas where the undergrowth is thin, and the soil is oddly compacted, despite never having been built on in living memory. There is, in the lower strata of that region's geological record, a layer that earth scientists have catalogued and moved past without extended comment, a layer of fused material stone that has been subjected to temperatures inconsistent with any natural geological process and inconsistent with any industrial process operating in that region at the period the layer is dated to. It is the kind of layer that gets noted and filed and not returned to, the kind of anomaly that a certain kind of researcher working outside the boundaries of sanctioned inquiry learns to recognize as a signpost. Somewhere beneath the floor of an inn that no longer exists, in a village whose name was struck from the records, in soil that has been undisturbed for the better part of 2 centuries, there may be an object that does not operate on any principle that the counting men's instruments were designed to detect. An object that carries within it a stored resonance. A civilization held in the way that a fire is held in banked coals, invisible on the surface, alive underneath. Marta knew that the counting men were coming, and she hid her letter in the bottom of a trunk, and she never sent it to her sister. But she wrote it. She wrote it in full knowledge that she might never be able to explain herself, that her sister might never read it, that the only people who would ever understand what she had witnessed were people she would never meet. She wrote it because she had been in the presence of something that the official world had decided could not exist, and she had felt in that presence the particular kind of recognition that comes when the shape of what you have always suspected turns out to have a name and a face and tired eyes. The giant walked into a world that had been built to make him impossible. And the last thing he said to her before she went upstairs to face the men at the door was a word in the older language, the one she could not understand. She wrote it down in the letter anyway, the best phonetic approximation she could manage. The archivist who found the letter spent a long time with that word. He compared it against the fragmentary lexicons of several languages that had been categorized as extinct, languages from the period that mainstream history places at the outermost edge of the recoverable past. He found one possible cognate. In a language that should have had no living speakers for at least 3,000 years before Marta's time, the closest route to the sound she transcribed carries a meaning that can be translated in several ways depending on context. It can mean remember. It can mean carry forward. It can mean do not let this be the last time it exists. The inn is gone. The village is gone. The maps have been redrawn many times since then. But the letter survived. It travelled in the false bottom of a trunk through 2 centuries and several pairs of hands that did not know what they were carrying. And it arrived, eventually, in the archive, where it waited for the kind of reader who would recognise what it was. A reader who had learned to look underneath the official layer of things, who knew what it meant when a village was erased and its names disappeared from every subsequent record. Who understood that the counting men were very good at their work, but that they were not, in the end, infallible. That things slipped through, that a woman alone in a root cellar with something heavier than it should have been, something warm with a warmth that was not temperature, had managed to do something that all the provincial authority in the world had not been able to undo. The coals are banked, the resonance is stored, and somewhere in the eastern foothills, in soil that has been undisturbed for a very long time, the last thing the giant entrusted to a woman who did not run is still waiting.